Yet we want this developmental opportunity that only liberty, only freedom can provide. As Mill moves towards answering that question, he is thinking about how to answer it in a way that will go beyond the boundaries of 1859 Britain, which is a good thing for us, because if he had written, here are a list of guidelines that my fellow Victorians ought to follow, wouldn't necessarily apply very well to us. We're not British, most of us. We're not in 1859. We want an abstract principle that will apply in any social and political setting. Not only is it important for this principle to be general and abstract so that it will apply in other contexts besides Mill's specific temporal and physical location, we also need an abstract principle so that we can get clearer about the rationale for constructing the principle in the way that Mill does. When he gives it to us in this broad general sense, we can start to think about why it's constructed that way and not just see it as a list of rules that we're supposed to follow that probably will get us the results Mill had in mind, but we don't know why or how. So, Mill is going to give us an abstract general principle that will tell us when we have the right to freedom so that we can pursue that eudaimonistic development, and when, on the other hand, society and the government have a right to control us. And notice in the way that I'm just putting things, I'm noting that there are two forms of control that Mill is concerned with. At first glance, we might have thought he's only concerned about legal control. He's only concerned about making sure we have just the right laws, the right explicit political policies to prevent other people from doing something bad to us, but not going so far so that I have to do all kinds of stupid things in order to keep my government happy, and now I don't have the political freedom that I need. Mill thinks that's an important area for him to divide the line between freedom and control. Political control, legal control, the explicit stuff we're aware of, that's really important. But Mill thinks there's a second form of control that he needs to find a way to deal with, and that's social control. This is implicit control. You're very rarely going to find any laws that say you should wear this kind of clothing and not that kind of clothing if you want other people to like you. You should speak in this way and not in that way if you want other people to give you opportunities in society. Most of the ways, Mill thinks, actually, in which we ultimately have to deal with control are those more implicit ways. The legal form of control is important, but he says the more subtle form of control is so problematic because, he says, it invades the very soul itself. If your government is telling you what speed you have to drive and you don't like the speed they're telling you you have to drive, that's kind of irritating. But if everyone around you has this possibly unfair estimation of you as a bad person, that's a lot harder to shrug off than, gee whiz, I really want to drive 80 miles an hour and people won't let me do it. So Mill says it enslaves the very soul itself because it starts to direct our own sense of who we are, what we ought to think and feel and desire and how we ought to behave. Now we're not talking about external control anymore, because we are so powerfully socially shaped. If we leave other people too much leeway to help construct our sense of who we are and who we should be, we're no longer going to be very interested in developing ourselves eudaimonistically. So Mill wants to try to find a way to divide the line between proper and improper social control as well. And that's going to be a much harder thing for him to do, precisely because it is implicit, precisely because you can't go to the people in your high school and say, you all aren't following the written down rules. They're not written down rules. They have to do with our attitudes toward one another and our treatment of one another. The principle that Mill comes up with is explicitly verbally oriented toward both forms of control. And as you'll remember, he first broaches the principle in chapter 1, in the introductory chapter. And you know that he's going to revisit it again in the 4th chapter. He'll give it more nuance, more detail in the 4th chapter. But right off the bat, on page 9, he wants to tell us this is the general idea I'm going to be developing and defending in this text. A general principle for dividing the line between proper and improper social and political control. And that dividing line is the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his or her will is to prevent harm to others. And if you think about it, this really is a characteristically modern Western point of view. We do tend, perhaps without having analyzed it, to think, you do your thing, I'll do mine, just don't get in my face too much, just don't hurt me, just don't do anything that messes my life up. And so the beauty of spending some time with Mill's text is that we can think more carefully about that principle that most of us do have some allegiance to, see it more completely articulated, and understand some of its strength, and also possibly think about any weaknesses that might be associated with it. So again, the basic idea is that you can only interfere with another person's freedom or liberty in either of those two ways, politically or socially, in order to prevent harm to other people or to punish harm to other people. And Mill reminds us of a couple of sort of boundary conditions that he has in mind to make sure that we don't misinterpret what he's talking about. He does want us to be clear that he's not telling us to stay out of one another's lives completely. In fact, he says explicitly, it would probably be a good idea if we talked more with one another, if we reasoned more with one another. Hey, do you realize that by not studying for responsible self, you could be kind of doing yourself in? You know, don't be really intrusive to the point that you start to control the other person socially, but it can help us to be neighborly with one another, to take an interest in one another. So that's something that Mill says when he gives us the first version of the principle on page 9 in chapter 1, but he cares about that so much that he restates it again when he gives us the more fine-grained version of the harm principle in chapter 4. He's not saying hands off totally from other people. Interact. Take an interest in one another's lives. Secondly, very important, we need to understand what Mill means by harm. And he doesn't tell us very much about that in chapter 1. It's one of the updates that we get in chapter 4, one of the reasons why we ought to keep reading, because we need to know more about what harm means. Does harm mean you looked at me funny and I went home and cried? If Mill is going to tell us we can never look at one another funny, we are definitely deep in the land of social control. Mill can't mean that. He can't mean anytime I feel a little offended by you, you have harmed me. He can't mean anytime there's a contest, we're all trying to get into Harvard Law School and only one person can do it, and you do it and I don't, you've thereby harmed me. Society would come to a grinding halt if we couldn't have competitions. You can't be constrained in all your behavior in order to keep me happy, or we're going to be way out of the land of liberty. So harm has to mean something very specific. I'm not allowed to harm you, but that can only be a fairly narrow boundary of things I'm not allowed to do to you, or else I'm going to be overly controlled. What we'll see when we get to chapter 4, again, we don't really have this clearly stated for us yet in chapter 1, is that Mill means we're not allowed to violate another person's rights. I might irritate you, I might make you unhappy, I might make you go home and cry, but as long as I haven't violated any of your rights when I irritated you, I've done nothing wrong as far as Mill is concerned, at least on the political and social scene. Maybe we might have another analysis if we were thinking about this in purely moral terms. But for the purposes of this text, harm means violating another person's rights. And notice, that's abstract. He's not giving us a list of the 6 things you must never do in order to harm someone. He's saying, don't violate somebody's rights. Well, what are my rights? If you want to know, where are you going to look? Explicitly at the laws in your particular society, not in 1859 Britain, and implicitly. There will probably be some social guidelines that people don't really bother to write down telling you what your rights are. And yeah, that makes things a little harder, a little fuzzier, because those things aren't written down, and yet we probably do have a pretty clear sense of what they are.